For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. This is Cybertide, a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. Today on the podcast, I'm talking with Mark Sangster, Vice President, Chief of Strategy at Adlumin. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Sounds like we've got a timely topic again.
As always, Mark, as we in the United States get closer to Election Day, it seems like we are constantly hearing concerns about voter fraud, false information on social media, foreign interference in our elections. There's just a lot going on. So a recent article in Politico highlighted findings from this year's DEF CON, where hackers identified vulnerabilities in voting machines that will be used in this year's election. But they also noted that these vulnerabilities are unlikely to be fixed before the election in November. Can you take us through this article? What were some of the findings and how concerned should voters be about vulnerabilities in these machines?
Yeah. So, I think like any complex system, right? As soon as you move to a digital environment, you expand the threat profile of any of those environments. And DEF CON is kind of a satellite conference of another big show called Black Hat, which I suppose has become a little more generic and markety. But these are the real operators, right? White hats, black hats, gray hats, whatever colored hats that are coming in and, are trying to poke holes in these systems. And some of them are kind of more ethical where they're going to notify the vendor. And in other cases, they're not. The problem with these systems is that vulnerabilities that they have are things like access to the system, data encryption, the controls that the companies have around things like development. And, I kind of call them at source or, from the well types of attacks, right? That's the classic, like the SolarWinds attack, right? You get administrative rights, you get in and you poison the system at source. And then, of course, it goes out and at any time, the criminals are at liberty to go and do what the heck they want. So I think it's, existentially disturbing because like many systems that are complex, they aren't necessarily going to get fixed in the next, what do we have, 6 weeks, right? Until the election, which means they're going to go out there and they're exposed. And worse, those systems, of course, get used by people who are, probably trained in electoral protocol, but not in this sort of the technical aspects of the system themselves. And because of the nature of an election, right, you have many fingers and many pots touching these systems. So it becomes harder and harder to control, right? It's not a simple, big central database somewhere where, only a privileged few can get to it. And, I call it existential because it's classic. It's going to erode truth. And frankly, I don't know what truth means anymore. I interviewed some journalists in the Ukraine and, of course, they're there with the war. And, that's what they said. They said there's no concept of truth. Trust is something different. Trust is like the most valuable commodity there. So, if you trust someone or you trust something, your life might depend on it. And when it comes to truth and facts, it's like, they said, you don't believe anyone's source, you go to 100 sources because, there's a missile strike and the Ukrainian government will say, oh, this is a successful attack. And then the Russians will go, no, it was a successful attack on our side. And, all that kind of stuff, right? And I'm sure that was the same in World War II. But it's unfortunate that the tenets of our society and our value as a democracy are, they're at a point where it's, somebody with a bit of fundamental computer hacking can make a difference and not for the right.
You mentioned public trust, and I wanted to ask you, how do the findings from this impact public trust in the electoral process, especially in light of potential allegations of election fraud? And you just mentioned there's a difference between trust and truth. Is there anything that can be done to mitigate this?
I don't think so, right? I think the genie is out of the bottle. Like, that's the problem is we can't agree on a baseline. You know what I mean? We can't just say, okay, so we believe 1 + 1 = 2. Now let's argue what that means. We're still at the point of sort of fighting the fundamentals of, well, does 1 + 1 actually equal 2? Or is it 3? Or is it 7? And, I think that's a big issue. So when you have things like this that in any way erode people's trust in the system, trust in the mechanics of the system, this just adds to it. Because now you get to the point of like, well, I see the facts, but, as we've seen in the last, how many years now, you attack the source, right? If you don't like the facts, then you go after the fact sayer, right? Well, it's a network I don't like. It's a group that I realize has some kind of bipartisan view of this, so I can't trust what they're saying. They have an agenda. And it's true, but now when you've got a system where you're like, yeah, there are vulnerabilities. They can be exploited. I mean, we saw this, after the last, going 4 years back, Maricopa County and, bringing in an organization to conduct cyber forensics on the systems in that county, right, that were used to tally votes that became a swing same thing. I think now there's just no basis, right? I don't know how to put it. There's no foundation. We don't have a solid sidewalk to walk on or a forum to actually discuss it. So I'm sure it's going to come up. I'm sure this will appear. I'm sure you'll see this in tactical areas across the country where this will be challenged. And, those voting machine companies, like we saw, I mean, one of them's still embroiled in legal challenges, in a massive billion-dollar lawsuit, multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. I think you're going to see more of that again, unfortunately, in 2024.
If there was one piece of advice that you could give to these people that are in the precincts, the ones that are on the ground kind of running these machines, you mentioned they're trained in voting protocols, but not necessarily security. If there's one thing that you could tell them, what would it be?
Oh man, go off the grid. And when I say that, I mean like no more Facebook, no more LinkedIn, no more, social media. Like get off of that. Use separate accounts that are set up specifically for this. Now, I'm sure you'll have government or municipally issued accounts, but do not share things, right? Don't share your password. Don't use the name of your dog, all that kind of stuff, right? Like get out of that, keep your nose clean, and follow the protocols that they give you. The other thing that we typically see during the elections is usually the armed forces will provide some kind of cyber defense support, right? Like the National Guard. So, for example, one of the people I work with, thank you for your service, sir. He's still in the Air Force National Guard and, he gets deployed for these kind of things, right? Where they'll roll up. So they are going to provide some level of cybersecurity monitoring and so on during the elections. But that's going to be looking for bigger levels of tampering, right? That's not necessarily going to be down in the proverbial voting trenches. So for those people, listen to what they say, take the training, pay attention because, people are after you, right? It's, enemies both foreign and domestic. So regardless of which side of the political equation you're on, the reality is somebody has a reason for affecting what you do. So just don't make yourself a target, right? Don't become an unwitting accomplice in something that is going to end up in national headlines.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Adlumin Inc. provides enterprise-grade security to mid-market organizations. Its security operations platform and managed detection and response services combines all your data into one view to illuminate security risks and accelerate security workflows. Security teams are often stretched thin and are faced with increasing threats to respond to like ransomware and data theft. Adlumin's patented technology simplifies these challenges by providing organizations with machine learning detection and automated response capabilities to halt threats quickly. The platform also includes threat hunting, automated incident response, vulnerability management, honeypots, darknet exposure monitoring, compliance reporting and monitoring, and more. Join the conversation and see how Adlumin can enhance your security program without increasing your workload. Visit adlumin.com.
And now, back to the podcast.
So that's a good segue into my next question, which is October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So some of the things that you mentioned, I think, are good takeaways for anyone, not just voters and not just election officials, but in the context of elections, which is what we're talking about today, what are some other things that voters should be aware of and maybe be doing to stay secure?
Look, whether you like it or not, we have seen report after report after report of influencing, if not tampering, right? And, MI5 in the UK just issued another report today talking about what they see as an increase in activity from Islamic groups associated or funded by Iran, as an example. So there's one lesson here is that when we see a kinetic act, right, when we see war in a region, so Israel and Iran, missile launching and all that kind of stuff, we generally seem to see some kind of echo or aftershock that occurs in the cyber world. We saw that with Russia invading the Ukraine. We saw lots of pre-cyber attacks, but then we started to see uptakes and activity in the West. So anybody that was against it, was being targeted. I think you'll see the same thing there. So you're going to see that kind of activity, but then, there is the kind of influencing. The other thing I think that's going to happen that I predict in 25 is right now, litigation tends to stand on the major stage, right? So it's the political party or a vending machine manufacturer or whatever gets sued. But I think we're going to start to see what I'm calling, and I don't know the legal term for it, so I just call it reverse class action suits. So that idea is instead of a whole bunch of parties getting together and suing somebody they think damaged them, the defendant, now it reverses. Where the plaintiff goes, you know what, you spreaded that deepfake AI, you spread that story about whatever it is, some politically impacting thing, and you can't back it up. And it had an impact. So guess what? That's called slander. Oh, you put it in writing. That's called libel. And going after you. So suddenly, somebody who's a bit of an activist And that's typically what they're going to do. If you're going to go after that, you're going to find the person who loves to post a lot, that has a large number of followers. So I think influencers in that sense you better dot your I's and cross your T's. So if you start spreading stories about aliens are the ones controlling the electoral machines or whatever it is, right? When I say aliens, I mean from outer space. Then I realized I shouldn't have said that. Then, you might be on the hook for that. Somebody might turn around and go, hey, you've accused us of all these things. Prove it. Because here's what it did to me. It damaged me personally. It affected me economically or, my job or whatever it might be. And you're going to have to stand up. So I think you got to recognize you can't just stand behind a movement and go, well, I was part of this. That's not going to happen, right? At the end of the day, movements don't go to jail or don't go to prison. People who took actions because of the movement are the ones that serve the time and have their lives affected. And I think that's not just going to move from the physical world. I think you're going to start to see that in the digital one as well.
We live in interesting times, Mark.
Oh, yeah. It was virtual. I used to kid, right? Virtual reality was, we always thought about flying cars and, alien worlds, right? Like Avatar. But then it kind of turned into, no, I work remotely at home and I access data on the other side of the world and I can transact with people who live in another country. But now I think it's just like, man, I couldn't tell you what's real and what's not real. Is it an illusion? What is fact? What is truth? All of that I think is gone. And I sort of think that now we're going to have in our virtual worlds, you're probably going to have a tribalism sort of form around what we fundamentally believe is let's call them our 10 commandments of just making it through a day.
Anything else you'd like to add on the topic of election fraud, Cybersecurity Awareness Month? Anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, for sure, right? I think we're going to see, I do think you're going to see a big step up in nation state activity. I think cyber attacks and cyber influence is only going to get worse. In fact, I kind of predict next year, one of the things I think is going to happen is we might start to see more of a coordinated effort between nation states that I would call that be akin to the alignments we saw during World War II. The allies of, Britain and the United States and Canada and Australia and so on, fighting the Axis armies of, Germany and at one point Italy and Spain and Japan and so on. I think you might start seeing the same thing where they start to pair up because it's like we're becoming more fragmented and more tribal again. While we live in a global economy, I think we're getting to that point of we're starting to have more specific beliefs and survival skills. So yeah, I think it's coming. So for companies, assume you're a target. For individuals, assume you're a target. I mean, there's that. I don't know if you saw the email that was going around. It named the person and it said, hey, dear Heather, and here's your phone number and here's the address you live at and a picture of your house. We've got video of you doing, bad things and we're going to post it to all your friends and your colleagues. That went around for a while. And I think we're going to see that and we're going to see the corporate kind of versions of it. So I think the Cold War is starting to heat up. Whether or not we'll get to the point where we launch missiles because of cyber activity, we've never quite gotten there, but who knows, man. Nowadays, I wouldn't count anything out. So maybe in 25 or 26, that's what we're going to experience.
Mark, as always, thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure.
I've been talking with Mark Sangster, Vice President and Chief of Strategy at Adlumin. For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. Cybertide is a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com.